In this video, I'd like to talk about installing the software that will be needed for this cohort. Microsoft has what's called an Integrated Development Environment, or IDE. And an IDE is a piece of software that allows us to not only create our interface and code our program, but also to be able to test it, debug it, and eventually create the package that will deploy it to other computers or other devices. We're going to be using Microsoft's Visual Studio 2019 Community Edition in this cohort. That runs on a PC running Windows 10. There is also a Visual Studio for the Mac. And while we'll incorporate that into this course, they are very different products and have different purposes. So if you're running a Macintosh, you will need to have access to a PC or to run Windows 10 on your Mac. You can do that with a program called Parallels and be able to boot into Windows on your Mac. But you are going to need the Visual Studio 2019 Community running in Windows 10 for a large portion of this class. The good thing is both of those products are free, and you can get to them online at visualstudio.microsoft.com and download those. I'll do that towards the end of the video. Now, before I get into how this is laid out, let me just remind you again, there are 3 courses in this cohort. CS162AD is a beginning level C# programming class. I assume you have no programming experience coming into that, and we're going to create Windows GUI projects, or graphical user interface projects, for the Windows desktop in this course. In this course, you're going to learn the foundational topics of how to program and how to create a GUI interface, a graphical user interface. We're going to spend about the first 7 weeks on that course, and then we're going to delve into the other 2 courses, which is CS165DC, creating cross-platform app development using what you've already learned in C#, but creating projects for both Android and iOS, as well as the Windows environment. We're going to focus probably on Android and iOS. And about the same time as we're going to do that, we're going to go through the advanced C# programming, which really focuses on what we call object-oriented programming and writing your own classes, and some fancy words there of encapsulation, inheritance, overloading, polymorphism, and abstraction, and what those mean and how those play out. We'll also look at getting into some database backends, and we'll take a brief look at server-side scripting with ASP.NET. So if we look at how this is laid out over the course of the semester, I color-coded these with the first course, CS162AD, being in red. And we're going to spend the first 7 or 8 weeks there. There'll be a little bit of the other 2 courses coming in during that time. But I want you to get this foundational level first. And then we'll delve into how do we move that into cross-platform app development using Xamarin. Xamarin is a product that's included in Visual Studio that's now owned by Microsoft, as well as how do we get into the more advanced levels of C# programming. And we'll do those kind of concurrently in the last half of the semester. But there will be a little bit of the first course coming into play in those courses as well. So as I said, there are 2 products here. Visual Studio 2019, again, we use the community version. There's also a professional version and an enterprise version. And the community version is free. Those other 2 are much more expensive. And they have bells and whistles that we do not need for this course. They're really kind of aimed at those who are professional developers and or those who are working in a team environment, which is the enterprise version. And I mentioned there's also Visual Studio for the Mac. Now, for CS162 and CIS262, the assignments and the lessons in those 2 courses are going to focus on the Windows desktop. And so you're going to need Visual Studio 2019 on a Windows 10 PC. But when we get into the CIS165DC, where we're doing the cross-platform, we're going to be focusing on creating mobile apps for Android and iOS in CS165DC, as well as you can create Windows projects for the Windows platform, which even includes things like Xbox. So on the PC side, we can create projects for both Windows and Android, as well as iOS. But there's a little caveat with the iOS I'll explain in a minute. But on a Macintosh computer, using Visual Studio for Mac, you can create projects that are cross-platform for both Android and iOS. And if you're going to create iOS apps, I really recommend doing that on a Mac. It makes it much simpler. But on the PC, We can write our code and create our interface in Xamarin Forms for an iPhone, iPad. However, you cannot build it on a PC. In other words, you can't compile it on a PC. Apple licensing requires any app for iPhone, iPad to be built on a physical Mac. And so you will need to have a Macintosh in your network that your PC can send the code to, have the Mac build it, send it back to the PC, and you can actually test it on the PC in an emulator. But you do need a Mac in your network to be able to build and test iPhone, iPad apps created on a PC. In the Canvas course site is a document that can be used as a reference on describing what you need to download in terms of Visual Studio. So if we go into the modules area of Canvas, in the very first module on Getting Started, you will find the Installing Visual Studio 2019 Community Edition. And you can open that up. I like to open up the PDF itself into Adobe Acrobat. So I'm just going to click it. I'm going to click this link, Download Installing Visual Studio PDF. I'm going to say Open, and it will open into Adobe Acrobat or Acrobat Reader, and you can scroll through. So in the next part of this video, I'm going to show you basically what to install, but this can be used as a reference as well. To download and install Visual Studio 2019 Community version, or even the Visual Studio for Mac, in your browser you can go to visualstudio.microsoft.com, and that's where I'm at here. And let's scroll down a little bit. There's a button down here for Download Visual Studio 2019, and you'll see the three versions of Community, Professional, Enterprise. I'm going to click on Community, and then it will start downloading, and you can either save that to your hard drive and then install it, or you can just simply choose Run and install it right away. So I'm going to click Run. I'm going to verify that I'm going to allow Microsoft to make changes. And we'll do a little bit of pre-installation. Basically, it's installing the installer. And this is going to ask you what you want to install for this setup of Visual Studio. Now, for CS 162 and 262, bare minimum, you need the .NET desktop development. I would also recommend installing the Universal Windows Platform development. That will be important as we get into the Xamarin stuff. The ASP.NET will be needed in CIS 262. I may try to do some things with Azure, so I'm going to suggest you also install the Azure development. If you wanted to take our Python class, you could check that one. However, you can always come back and add these in. And then for the Xamarin, you definitely want the mobile development with .NET. And I may try to do a few things with Unity. Unity is a game engine that's become very popular, so I would suggest maybe also installing the Unity game development. Now, of course, the more you install, the more more space it's going to take. And finally, I always like to do the extension development. That's me. It's not really required for this course. And again, you can always come back and install additional things. Over here on the right-hand side, you get a summary of what's being installed. And for each of these, you can actually look at what's being included. There's a language called F#. Not extremely popular, but it's an option. You can add that in if you wanted. I'm not going to bother to do that. I do like to add in some of the .NET. If you want to look at stuff from older computers or create apps for older computers, I think those frameworks are helpful. Again, it's going to take up more space if we do that, so those are optional. For the Universal Windows, I'm going to include the Graphics Debugger and GPU Profiler for DirectX. And I'll make sure I have the Windows 10 SDK. I'll just choose the most recent. ASP.NET, we'll leave that as is. Same with the Azure development. The mobile development of .NET. I'm going to include the .NET Compiler Platform SDK. and the class designer. And I'll leave these as is. So now I'm ready to install. I can click the install button. And you see I've got some other versions of Visual Studio installed already, but I'm seeing the progress of installing Community 2019. This is going to take several hours. I would suggest go grabbing some dinner, some lunch, some breakfast, whatever, taking a break, come back in a couple hours and see where you're at. Depending on the speed of your computer and whether you have a solid state drive versus a normal hard drive, can make a big difference, as well as the amount of memory and your connection speed to the internet.